Good afternoon, everybody. It's time to get started with our program. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. I'm Karen Flanagan, Boma Orange County's 2020 President and Executive Vice President for Greenlaw, representing Boma OC today. Prior to this COVID-19 pandemic, the relationship between tenants and landlords was managed by the terms of the lease. Yet now, with tenant-focused government involvement, both at the state and local level, many building owners and managers are forced to abide by certain restrictions, rules over non-payment of rent by tenants, and in some areas, eviction restrictions. With that being said, there are a number of strategies that landlords can implement in order to place themselves in a better position, both financially and contractually. And we're here to talk about these strategies today. We're privileged to be joined by 4 key executives in Orange County commercial real estate who will talk about these COVID-19 legal matters that are pressing amongst many building owners, landlords, and managers. They're going to share their experiences and some pointers for us today. Before we get started with the program, if you could please look at your screen. We'd like to take this opportunity to thank Boma Orange County's annual partners. Thank you, partners, so much for your support of Boma Orange County. As you know, without you, our educational platforms, such as today's town hall, would not be possible. Second, I'd like to thank our committee members, whose names are listed on your screen, for all their behind-the-scenes coordination of this virtual town hall. Takes some time. It truly does take a village, and we really appreciate all of their time and efforts to put this together for everybody. Next up, we have a couple BOMA announcements. Let's start with Boma Orange County's Philanthropy Committee. They will be hosting an online diaper drive fundraiser benefiting Homemade Orange County. The drive is going to take place from June 8th to June 19th. So please keep an eye out for those emails with more information and a link to donate. It's a great opportunity to give back and get involved. Also, please join for our next On the Menu event on Thursday, June 11th at 12 p.m. for an in-depth discussion about security issues affecting the return to work. This is going to be presented by Chris Bailey of Allied Universal Services, and it will include security topics related to return to work, security company protocols, COVID-19 effects on security processes, and other current events affecting security at your property. Also on June 11th at 5:30, Boma Young Leaders is hosting a virtual Had a Cocktail event. This should be a fun networking opportunity for everybody. So please look out for that. And you can find more information about these and our upcoming events, as well as register for any of them at our website, bomaoc.org. Okay, let's get started with our program. I'm happy to announce today's moderator, David Wensley, who is the managing partner for the Orange County office of Cox and Castle Nicholson, LLP. David works with a broad array of clients, including the representation of office, industrial, developers, owners and investors, corporate firms, and various consultants, including property management, brokers, and contractors. He brings more than 30 years of legal experience to us and is adept in several fields such as acquisitions, dispositions, purchase and sale transactions, leases, joint ventures, lending, construction, environmental, and many more. David's also been a speaker and a panelist for real estate organizations such as NAIOP, ICSC, Cornet, Global Boma, and UCI Mirage Center for Real Estate. Welcome, David.
Thank you, Karen. Happy to be here for Boma today. We have a lot to cover in a very short time, so we'll get right to it. But before we do, just want to give out the caveat that our discussion today with very experienced experts, of course, is going to include some recommendations and guidelines, but everybody out there listening should take those into account and consult with their particular expert consultants, attorneys, and advisors, as a lot of what we're going to talk about is really implemented, and I think our panel will emphasize this, on a very case-by-case, property-by-property, property type, and landlord-tenant relation and dynamics of the market. So there's no do-all, be-all for the things we're going to cover today. Really happy to have this panel. It's a really diverse panel. So we have Richard Side with us. I'm not going to go into all the lengthy bios for each of them because we'll run out of time for our conversation. But their bios are all found on the BOMA website for this event. Richard comes to us with the legal perspective from the landlord side of the equation, representing owners, investors, and property managers from a landlord perspective. Then we have Pat Donahue, who's the chairman and CEO of Donahue Schreiber. He brings with us many years' experience in a very large portfolio of commercial retail properties, and he'll be giving us some perspective, particularly focused on the retail arena. And then we have Mike Bennett from the Irvine Company, who also brings extensive experience from the operations side and ownership side, with some particular emphasis on the office and mixed-use property types for the Irvine Company. So very happy to have all three of you here today. And we're going to try to cover a lot of topics that we've all been traumatized about since the middle of March about. So we'll get right into it. We hope to cover everything we had on our list of issues on the website. We also have a question and answer feature on the webinar. So if you have a question, type it in, send it in, and our BOMA management will look at the questions, and if we can fit those in, they'll be great. We'll try to answer those. I can direct them to any one of the panelists. And we will also have a question and answer program, hopefully timed toward the end, to answer questions if we don't answer them during the program. So let's get to it, and we'll start with Rick. And on the legal side, without getting into some of the specific legal laws, actions that the government has taken, various courts and counties, state, federal, and local governments in terms of treatment of tenant relations by landlords. Can you comment about what landlords have faced with the variety of legal claims that tenants have, proffered based on why they should be allowed to not pay rent, defer rent, terminate leases? There's lots of different legal theories that they throw out there at our landlord clients. Can you comment on that a bit, Rick?
Yeah, thanks, Dave. None of the orders and ordinances and moratoriums that are out there say that tenants don't owe rent. They defer it, they postpone it, they limit landlords from pursuing it, but they don't say it's not owed. So tenants and their attorneys have gotten creative and have come up with some arguments as to why they don't owe rent at all. When this thing first started back in March, the clause in a lease that was thrown out to landlords most often was the force majeure clause. That's a clause that landlords never looked at, never negotiated, because no one ever thought that any of the provisions that were in there were going to come to fruition or arise. But the response to most tenants when they raise that issue is that A, there hasn't been any litigation ever about whether a virus pandemic and ensuing legislation constitutes an event of force majeure. But more importantly, most force majeure clauses say that if there is an event of force majeure, it does not exclude the payment of rent. Most of your leases out there will say that. And usually if you quote that back at the tenant and his attorney, that ends the discussion. That ends that particular argument. Another couple of arguments that are thrown out there, for example, the AIR form lease doesn't have a force majeure clause. So tenants use the argument that the purpose for which they lease the space has been frustrated, or it's impossible for them to perform the use that they were supposed to perform in the premises, and that therefore they are precluded from having to pay rent while the event lasts. The argument's not a bad one. It's certainly not an argument that any landlord should concede to a tenant. And again, there's no litigation as to whether what we're going through now, excluding the riots that are going on now, that a pandemic and legislation promulgated after a pandemic constitutes impossibility or frustration of purpose. But it is an argument that tenants are throwing out there that landlords, at least initially, are going to need to deal with and decide that they're not going to pursue or go down that road. Another argument that some tenants have thrown out there is that the pandemic and the legislation constitutes a taking of their property without due process. I think that's an incredibly weak argument, but it's an argument that's out there that again, you're going to have to deny, and there's no litigation on it, so there's no case law on it. And finally, some tenants are arguing that what's going on now interferes with their quiet enjoyment of the premises. The quiet enjoyment clause that's either specifically stated in a lease or is an implied covenant of the lease generally says that the landlord will not interfere with the quiet enjoyment of the tenant, and nothing that's going on now has originated with the landlord or is being pursued by the landlord. So again, not an argument that I think carries much weight.
And on that last point, Rick,
Yeah.
that would presume that the landlord didn't make the election, for example, to close down an office building on its own, absent a government order to do so, right?
Yes, that would be correct.
So on all those topics, if I could interject, Pat and Mike, I'd be curious to get your input, because Rick brings up a lot of these claims that tenants make, and obviously the tenant community is quite varied in terms of how much government intervention or stay-at-home orders have impacted their business. Some have been absolutely shut down, restaurant or a health club or a movie theater, for example, perhaps county by county. In other cases, it's the stay-at-home order. Companies like my own, we can work from home. So we are still working, though we're not using our office space to the degree we used to. Is there a difference in the way you respond to tenants, Mike and Pat, that advance some of the arguments that Rick summarized for us?
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in, Dave, just quickly. I think, we've had certainly this, because of the unprecedented nature of just this whole pandemic, we've had customers come at us from different angles, mostly in good faith, honestly. Some of them trying to take some of those governmental, new revised orders or angles to indicate, the buildings are just not open or not available. And, we're fortunate to have a good legal team with people like Rick that have been quickly available to have dialogue with them and to unpack kind of those justifications and do it as quickly as we can, because the truth is our buildings as essential infrastructure has been open from the get-go, and we've allowed whether people use that space or not is kind of discretionary, and it varies quite a bit. But we've just reaffirmed the fact that our buildings are open, they're operating, they're safe. And if somebody wants to get into the more nuanced, then we'll do it as a little bit of a sidebar. But I feel like those conversations have been pretty effective and healthy so far.
But the important element for you is keeping the services going, keeping the security there, keeping the buildings open and operating, so the tenant can't claim that the landlord is interfering with their enjoyment of the space.
That's right.
Correct?
Exactly.
Pat, how about you on the retail side? It's a little bit different, since retailers are pretty obvious whether they're boarded up or not, or operating.
Yeah, Dave, it's been obviously a very challenging time on the retail side of things. I'm happy to report that out of our centers, all of our centers remained open through all of this because of the essential retail aspects. So the grocery stores, the drug stores, the fast food tenants, most of the restaurants have stayed open with takeout. Frankly, we're collecting about 60% of our rents. And so out of the retail world, that's at the higher end of that group. I'm thankful I'm not in the mall business anymore. But I think to follow up on Michael's comment, and it really is about the reasonableness of what's going on. We approach, and I would encourage anybody to approach their real estate, or particularly retail real estate. We think occupancy is the major metric we have to work with. It costs so much to replace a tenant from a commission, TI and TAs, legal, all the nonsense that you have to go through. And so we really worked very hard with our tenants and listened to them. We wanted to hear about it. we were able to, and we've deferred a substantial amount of money. I don't want you to tell you that this has been a great 2 months. I've never worked so hard in my life in the last 2 months, but we were able to defer about $50 million on a $200 million annual income stream. So that'll give you a sense of the scale that we were able to do that. But in doing that, I think we've built relations with the tenants going forward. I think they're gonna look favorably on that. Going to Rick's points, I just don't think the landlord has much leverage in California on the West Coast on this subject. I've talked to guys in Texas and they call, well, Pat, aren't you going to default them? And we get 10 days in Texas, they get the whole building back. And I'm going, well,
Do they want it back?
Well, yeah, most of the
Your
time.
point about keeping tenants, then what?
Yeah, but most of the time, in Texas, they want it back, and frankly, even if I wanted it back, you're really swimming upstream on this deal with the things Rick talked about, the moratoriums. And then, as you've said, there's arguments both ways. I'm a landlord, and I'm not sure I want to be in a court of law saying, well, the government told them they couldn't open, but I get my rent. I mean, in California, I'd be very nervous about that. I don't know if I'm right or wrong, but I don't want to carry that flag. So we've really gone and tried to make deals. I'm very pleased with our progress of making deals with our tenants and deferring the rent. We have waived very little rent, and we'll talk about that later kind of on tactics. But I think it's got to be reasonable both sides. And so far, at least early on, I thought the parties were very reasonable. I think everybody's getting a little deal fatigue now.
Yeah, they're stretched now.
Yeah, and I was on a phone call last week with the ICSC trustees. There were 125 people on this call, and I can tell you there's a major war brewing between landlords and tenants. And frankly, I'm not going to get in it. I've already solved it. I've deferred the rent, and we'll worry about it later.
So we get that request, Rick, from a lot of our landlord clients, many of whom are smaller sized and have smaller properties than what Pat and Michael work with. And they're concerned that they don't have the leverage. And what leverage do they have, or did they have? The typical leverage was always the notice of default, interest rate accrual on late payments, perhaps a late charge, and then ultimately the notice to pay rent or quit and get the space back in a market where potentially there are replacement tenants that you could do better with, which is a question that Pat raises, and I think Michael would raise as well. Are there really the tenants out there to replace a tenant, even if you could evict them? But so clients have been coming to us for the last 6 weeks. Should I send them a notice of default? Should I send them a 3-day notice? Should I send them a notice to pay or quit? Talk a little bit about that in the context of what Pat and Michael have said about working out deals, and also in the context of some of the legislation that's come down on the city and county and from the governor in terms of these eviction moratorium. I think moratoria, those are not fully understood by people out there. But further that, plus the courts being tied up with COVID-related limitations, where's the leverage on the UD front for any of this?
There isn't a lot of leverage at this point, unfortunately. So initially, when the governor's state of emergency came out, he said to local jurisdictions, okay, you can put in eviction moratoriums if you want. So city of LA did, the county of LA did, a handful of cities in LA County did, Orange County, Riverside. All of those moratoriums had requirements. Tenants were supposed to let landlords know that they were adversely impacted. Some of them had repayment features that said you've got 3 months or 6 months to repay it. And just when we were all coming to grips with what the various moratoriums said and how long they were going to last, California Judicial Council on April 6th said, no UDs in California, period, end of story. You don't have to say anything about how you've been affected. We're not going to let you file or issue a summons on an unlawful detainer case. That order will be in effect for 90 days after the governor lifts his state of emergency. The state of emergency has not been lifted yet. So let's say for the sake of argument, June 30th, the governor lifts the state of emergency. The judicial council order will be in effect July, August, and September, which means there aren't going to be any unlawful detainer cases in California until October. Even when those cases can go forward, then you got to start looking at the underlying moratoriums that various cities and counties have put into place. Because, for example, the County of Los Angeles says any money that the tenant owes the landlord that accrued during the period of their moratorium, they're going to have a year to pay it back. So you're not going to be able to serve notices to pay rent or quit for the money that accrued during the moratorium period. So short answer is notices to pay rent or quit may make a landlord feel good now to serve them. And in fact, some ordinances say you can't serve them, but for the most part you can, but it's not going to get you anywhere.
So Michael used a term that's very important to the Irvine Company's approach. He calls the tenant the customer. And Pat mentioned that the relationships and maintaining the tenants is critical to long-term success of the centers. So hopefully there is that collaboration and some give and take in negotiating terms for deferment, some sort of rent relief. Short of that, where tenants just go dark and don't pay, in light of those eviction moratoria and restrictions out there, Rick, and also Pat and Mike, are you taking a different approach with tenants that don't communicate and don't pay? And in other words, are you serving them with notices of non-payment? We're accruing the rent, we're accruing the deferred interest, we're accruing late charges. Do you have a different tactic with those that don't communicate at all? And just
maybe I'll let Mike and Pat speak to that.
Yeah, I'll just jump in quick. You know, it's a challenge, obviously, when that situation occurs for our teams, because I think more than ever before we've put ourselves out in front and made ourselves accessible as a company. We've tried to make clear that we are ready to listen and hear, you know, a business situation, understand what our customer's up against. We do have some paths for solution and deferment. It's not, you know, our approach is not as defined as even our sister divisions in retail, and like Pat shared with the retail sector, but we're super accessible, and I think our team's reaching out a bunch. If we get to a point, though, where either communication is stopped, and it's a very small percentage for us, thankfully, but we are proceeding with demand letters and then actually sending a letter of default. So we're not proceeding with a UD action or, you know, a court case, but we are letting them know that they may be forfeiting some of the rights under their lease through that default. So it's been like I said, a pretty small percentage. I think we've collected about 96% of our rents for April and 94, 95, I think, for May. And that includes companies that we've worked out deferment on. So we're in a pretty healthy situation, but there are going to be those tough times, and there are going to be failures, and we're trying to understand those well through our process, and where we know there's unlikely viability, we're working towards some winding up some leases, but it's been a small percentage thus far.
Pat, one comment you made, you and the Irvine Company are in a fortunate position where you probably have lower financial leverage that allows you to absorb some deferment. We had a question come in related to that, and I was going to ask you about the leverage factor. The smaller owners out there that perhaps start off over leveraged can't afford to defer and reduce rent and grant concessions to tenants as much as perhaps Donahue Schreiber can and the Irvine Company can. What's your recommendation for the small owner out there as to how to deal with these deferments, if you have any, or deal with your lender in trying to get their approval to allow for some deferrals in this situation?
Well, we've been told, we haven't gone and used it, but let me address lenders first. We've been told the banks have been, and they've approached us that, hey, is everything fine? We said, we're not worried about making our debt payment. We're worried about covenants that could come into play down the road here as you look at income measurements for April, May, and June, and we want consideration for that. But I think the bank lenders and life insurance companies, I think, have really gone out of their way to say that, hey, if you need 3 months of abeyance, that's fine. If you need 6, you got to show us a lot more stuff, but maybe we'll push it off 6. I can tell you the CMBS market is a big, big problem. If you have a CMBS loan, that was one more thing that came out of the trustees meeting. The CMBS borrowers were panicked because they can't get anybody to talk to and any consideration on that. So I would think that you clearly, if you're a small operator, you want to make sure that you can talk to your lender. If you can't with the CMBS, I'm not in that market. I don't get in that market because of this reason. But that's on you. I don't know. I don't know what you're supposed to do with that. But if you have a bank loan on this, I think you have to spend some time with your banker. What was the question, Dave? The first part of that. I answered the second part of the question. Now I've lost my train of thought on what was the first.
Some of it was about leverage and probably what would the impact be on leverage deals in the future. Maybe you could to that.
Listen, we by no manner are the Irvine Company, I promise you. And every dollar that goes out of this place is a dollar that's very valuable to everybody. I just think that as a landlord and a small landlord, I just think it's more of a philosophical issue. Nobody can afford what's going on. Nobody can afford it. And I just think you philosophically have to decide, are you going to go fight with tenants when what you've just heard from Rick is it's a very uphill battle? And then I would layer in that you're going to have more supply come on the market because they will throw keys at you in various sectors. And is it worth it to get them, out of the, is it worth it to say, oh, I'm right, you're out of here, and now I'm vacant? It's no fun, guys. I mean, I'm as tough can be, but you have no leverage at the moment. And I think cooler heads, even in a small operation, I think you got to be smart and say, hey, I got to play down the road. I got to stay in this thing. And yeah, I'm getting my hat handed to me at the moment, but if you hang in there, otherwise it's nuclear war. And I just that never is a very good option.
So 2 questions for Mike and Pat on that note. And Rick, you can chime in terms of how you're documenting these kinds of things as well. But so given that leverage dynamic, what are you trying to get from your tenants and customers in exchange for some of this relief, deferment, treatment that you're giving them, concessions you're giving them because you kind of have to, and and eviction isn't an option. So what are you asking for? What are you getting? And what's important to you to make that feel a little better and to have a negotiated resolution?
Yeah,
Mike?
Dave, I'll just throw it out quick. I think the first thing that we're asking customers for is to demonstrate a clear and eminent need for rent relief, period. What we're saying and what we've said from the get-go is our focus really needs to be on the companies who have a clear risk of survival in the very near term. We just don't have the time and resources to focus on every customer. So we're asking, and sometimes that's a hard conversation, right? Because almost everyone's affected to some level, but we're just really trying to focus on the customers that we need to work with. And we're saying we may talk in 30 days and 60 days. We're going to be here and we're going to be open to dialogue. So, I think we've ended up approving about 40% of our 450 requests right now. So, but of the customers that we are dealing with, we're really, we're trying to do a few things that are reasonable. We want to make sure we're taking the opportunity to clean up first off, if there's any just lingering issues, this is a time to say, let's put those to bed. Let's not kick the can on that. Let's make sure we clean up anything that's unclear or some degree of a dispute. Furthermore, in certain cycles, you give up more concessions than you would in other times. So we're not trying to do anything that's unreasonable or harm a business. things like signage, we're not going to touch, but there may be things like termination options and, if the expansion rights feel excessive, I think we're going to take a hard look and say, is it reasonable for us to claw back a few items in return for us providing some flexibility for that customer to sustain and survive down the road. So it's an important balance that Pat said it right at the outset. It's all about relationship and experience, and especially for a long-term owner, but I think any owner, the cost of transactions are too high. This is about hitting a seam, which is understanding the customer, maintaining that long-term relationship, and still protecting your business interest. It's an interesting balance, but that's, I think, just a couple thoughts I'd share.
Yeah, Dave, I'd add to that that's exactly what I just wrote down before he mentioned it was cleaning up issues. When we've deferred, frankly, we haven't gotten a lot out of the deferral, and this is dealing with Ulta and TJX and Ross and all those different tenants. And we've deferred rent for those people. And I mean, it's been a real argument inside the company, but that, hey, well, they're great companies. They can afford it and they can do this, they can do that. We've taken an approach that they've asked us to help participate in this. And if we can do this, we're going to do it. And we are going to clean up issues. The issues really that you try and get on the table are those things that are kind of unnecessary that are there that they might be able to give up. So some co-tenancies, some exclusives, some restrictions. I mean, this is all about opening up more opportunity to lease our properties to other people. And when you have somebody, and I'm not going to pick on Ross, but I'll pick on Ross, if they have an exclusive to, no gyms or something next door, I mean, let's get rid of that. Okay, well, for my deferral, I'll give you that. We have deferred, like I said, a lot of money, and we really haven't gotten a lot of consideration on the deferral. When we've waived rent, which we have done some of, I would say we've waived maybe $3 million, again, on that $200 million revenue stream. We've probably waived $3 million. But for that $3 million, we clearly have a return on that investment. And frankly, it's been a fabulous return because we'll get, if we're going to waive money, you got to go give us something. You got to change the CAM pool clause that, that you're not paying security, or you're not, you're GLA versus GLOA or whatever it is. Or lift that exclusive that we have. But more importantly, we made a little bit of hay getting them to extend options or exercise options. And I really, doing this for so long, you got to remember, Tom Schreiber taught me this years and years ago. The options are entirely on the tenant side of things. Option rent can only go down.
Yep.
So if in fact you can go get a tenant to exercise an option at the called upon rate and not discount it in this environment, we think that's probably a pretty good bet, where there could be quite a bit of availability of boxes 3 years out. If you were guessing, the chances are it's going to be a tight market or a loose market. I would say probably a loose market. So if you can exercise that option for that waiving of rent, we think that's a fantastic return on investment. And I would argue the $3 million that we've put into rent waiver and wrote it off has probably produced about $30 million in valuation when you look at those options. So
you look at it. I think on the retail side too, probably in terms of giving up concessions, we talked about this offline before, that this situation is just accelerating what was already happening on the retail front to a degree, with some shift to e-commerce and some smaller businesses struggling as it were anyway, and repositioning of centers to more mixed use basis, allowing for uses that were typically precluded in retail, such as apartments, other recreational type uses, more restaurants, more parking intensive uses, which may not be a concern now because people just want customers and people to come back to the center, so that maybe your tenants will want to give up those things in hopes that you can reposition some of your product for the next wave of what works in retail, right?
Yeah, I think this clearly has accelerated the acceptance of internet retailing. I mean, you're all going to be shocked that the internet before this made up less than 10%, of retail sales. Amazon doing about 4% of that. And those are fact. Go on the internet, go really look at it. Don't look at pundits, but go into the facts and figure it out. And so, this has accelerated that. But frankly, I think particularly for small shopping center owners, you need to, and we made this shift years ago, you need to do things that that you can't do on the internet. So we are so much more service oriented today than we were. We're so much more medically oriented than we are today, both pet and human, right? So anything to do with medical now, we have that. And frankly, I think you're going to see some small suburban type WeWork space come into shopping centers. It seems to me that's a interesting. I mean, it's really a little more of a formality of what actually goes on at Starbucks. If you go into Starbucks,
Right.
Everybody has their office, right?
Or the kiosks that get the pop-up deals. That
Yeah, and I think so. So the point is, I think you got to go and you always look at who's going to rent the space, and that is going to change. And the internet is having a very, very big effect on that. However, it is not the effect that's being talked about in the narrative. It is clearly wreaking more havoc in the mall business because it's apparel based, and the malls are all apparel based, and they've got a whole nother issue. So I won't go into that. That's a whole nother subject. But this has accelerated the adoption of this. A lot of people think the grocery store model is at some risk because of the internet ordering, and people were doing it now and they're getting comfortable with it, a little more comfortable. I'll tell you that in my conversations with the actual grocers, they are having much more success and see a future of order on the internet and pick up at the store than they are delivery. And again, I just have to go back. The business, it is so amazing the amount of free labor that the customer provides for these operators. I mean, think about the grocery store. You're going in, you're picking the stuff, you're testing the bananas. You're taking it, and now we're going to deliver it for a very minimal price. Wow, that's not in their interest. They don't want to do that. And by the way, Amazon doesn't want to do that either because they know it's a money loser, and that's why they're actually going to go open stores. Because the amount of labor that is supplied by the customer, by you and me, is remarkable, and I think it's really efficient.
Those are all really great points. Hey, some questions came in, Rick, particular from the legal side. The first one related to landlord actions, and specifically someone asked, and we haven't talked about this, you and I, beforehand, so it's a little side note, but about abandonment and whether or not a landlord can claim, in this environment, can claim that a tenant has abandoned premises so as at least to get possession back, assuming, and this would assume in my mind that the tenant is not communicating, because obviously if the tenant wants to give their space back and walk away, that's a voluntary thing. You can negotiate an early termination, maybe a payment, something to get the space back for a higher, better use. But if they're not communicating and they aren't paying because of COVID, do you think there's any legs to trying to claim an abandonment in the context of where we are in the legal arena?
Yeah, I do. I mean, we're doing it for clients. The standard is haven't paid your rent and you reasonably believe they've abandoned the premises. So if someone is not communicating at all and they're never there and there's no outreach of any kind, and you look inside and mail's piling up inside the space, I think a notice of belief of abandonment at a minimum is going to get the tenant to respond to you if they haven't abandoned. And if they don't respond to you, then under the statute, you've got the right to take back the space.
Any idea how long that would take to, in the current court system, lockdown, getting something approved?
Well, the abandonment notice isn't a court-based system, a court-based procedure. It's a statutory procedure that requires mailings by the landlord, and it's an 18-day notice. So you're circumventing the courts. You're not going through the court. It gets you the possession of the space back, and then you can worry about trying to argue about the money that's owed because those cases are not barred. Those cases can proceed.
So the big item on everyone's mind, I know this is keeping Pat up at night and Mike as well, is SB 939.
Yeah.
And everybody out there, BOMA, NAIOP, ICSC, the lending community is spending a great deal of money battling this legislation that provides very provocative California-oriented protections for tenants in terms of rent deferment, rent abatement, and termination rights. Do you have any intel as to where we are in that process right now and what that's looking like?
Yeah, well, this is hot off the presses as of this last weekend. This is a bill, legislation sponsored by Senator Weiner from up in the Bay Area, who is no friend of commercial landlords by any stretch. He's also involved in the split roll thing that's going on too. So in any event, the bill made it out of the Senate Judiciary Committee. It will go in front of the full Senate at the end of June. Without getting political, one can assume that the Republican side will vote against it. If 3 Democratic senators also vote against it, then the bill is not going to pass. So one of the important things that everybody can do at this point is to write letters like a madman to your state senator, to your state assemblyman, bombard these guys with letters as to why they should not vote in favor of this. If it passes the Senate at the end of June, it'll go in front of the Assembly, and if it passes the Assembly, it would become law as of the end of August. But right now, it's made it out of committee, and it's on its way to the Senate for at least a preliminary vote. I don't know if you want me to talk about any of the provisions in it, but they're disastrous. They're unconstitutional, but of course we're not going to have a decision on the constitutionality of the bill if it passes for years yet. So the goal now is to stop it dead in its tracks.
And I think our listeners can go on the BOMA website. I know the NAIOP website. Probably you can just Google SB 939 and you'll find all sorts of literature and the top 10 bullet points of what this bill could possibly do to the landlord and ownership community. So it's definitely something we're all tracking, and your recommendations for the landlord ownership community to write about it and fight about it is key.
Hey, Dave, this is Pat. Is there a form letter on those websites that people can use? Sometimes it's a lot easier if you have something, you don't know much about a subject and you're fighting the subject.
I think BOMA does have a form letter. If not,
we can put one together.
Yeah, we can get one for you.
I think for all that are on this call, you need to get that letter and send it to our state representatives. This is a dangerous bill for the state of California, frankly. And so I think we can't stress enough. I think California Business Properties Association and ICSC, the ones that I've been involved with on this subject, are doing a really good job.
Yeah.
It's all about us, making ourselves, available and chewing on the ears of these people in Sacramento.
I can tell you that Irvine Company's working very hard, behind the scenes with a variety of legislative advocates and really throwing, all the efforts of our company behind it. And but we need more. It needs to be broad-based. So I think that encouragement is important, Pat, Dave.
Yeah, I think it needs to be more broad-based. I think that we play, the big players, they get it, and then they're saying, well, that's because you guys are all rich, and that's why you're doing this. We need the populace to get into this, and the small owners and operators and managers and everything else. This is a train wreck, and it needs to be stopped, and we should stop it.
Yeah.
So I'm reminded that the Boma Political Action Committee has a resource page that includes SB 939 info and probably some ideas on how to write in and voice yourself on this issue. A couple more quick questions. We're getting close to the wire. Before we open up, we've been answering some questions along the way, so not sure if we'll have a formal Q&A at the end or just keep it going. But a couple things related to force majeure and rent relief you're giving. At the outset of this whole situation, back in March, when we thought it was a 2-month sort of scenario, some of the big companies came right out of the blocks and said, give us 2 months of rent deferral, and then we'll start paying again in June. Now we're in June. So are you seeing that tenants are asking for more than 2 months typically, and this relates to defining force majeure, which we've kind of concluded is not an excuse. Are tenants insisting that there be a clawback for the future if there's a recurrence of COVID in the fall, and are they asking to really define it that it is an excuse, and if it happens again, we're going to want more? So to all three, I guess.
Yeah, I would say that we've signed 200 documents on this that were more along the lines of deferring probably more than 2 months, but probably no more than 5 months. And I am waiting for the second wave, but have not had much of that come back at all and ask again. I think they're so busy asking everybody else that they've gotten what they've gotten from us. So I haven't had a lot of retrades. We are getting quite a bit of conversation now from those that are caught in the phase of reopening. So if you're not if you don't open until phase 3 or phase 4, what's that mean? And we need some more consideration. And frankly, we're saying, hey, we're going to look at it. We don't know what we don't know. We're not going to go make a deal for 4 years on something which people have asked for. Starbucks comes to all of us and says that they want us worrying about their 12-month profit margin. That's not reasonable, I don't think. Sorry, anybody from Starbucks on the phone, but
well, last time I checked, you weren't necessarily a Starbucks investor necessarily.
Yeah.
Right.
Certainly not a credit investor.
Right. Yeah.
Hey,
Yeah. I'm
Dave.
not sure who credit is anyways. I always bristle when people they're a credit tenant. I mean, you watch where the credit tenants are in this deal. They're the first people asking you for rent relief, for God's sake.
Yeah. Dave, you asked about, just give you a little perspective on kind of the trends, at least as we're seeing them. We tended to push our, rent payback sometime between fall and the first of the new calendar year. So we've done that. I think the requests have been varied. I think there's a lot that, as Pat said, might have been a couple months, but there's certainly customers that have asked for much more. We've tended to stay between 2 and 3 months of rent, and oftentimes just partial rent. We're trying to, at least on the office side, kind of continue to ask for some shared participation. And I think we're getting to a point, I shared, we're probably at about a 40% approval. Some of those companies that we, declined right now are coming back, and they have now updated business cases, right? They have some new factual experience to share with us, and we're going to be listening to that. So I think we expect this to carry on, and it's hard to know when it'll end. But I will say, at least from our side, it has tapered way down from the early months. We've got a task force of 15 people, a number of our key VPs, and Chris Popman, Holly McManus, and a whole team of analysts, and some acquisition, development, finance team that we've pulled together that are working full time. But I would say we're way down on the trend line. It's just hard to know. Pat said how long this goes, how many are going to come back. Most of these companies have a good plan, but the plan is just that. until we see how consumer confidence comes back and the general economy and what capital investment, all those things look like. It'll be hard to know.
Yeah, we're starting to see some increased bankruptcy filings, which is probably obviously likely as well. So that's going to throw another wrench in the timing and the ability of landlords to deal with tenants through bankruptcy, and particularly if they're reorganizations under Chapter 11. So I think we're all just getting there. I know that somebody has posted a letter. I think we can probably get this out to our audience from the BOMA team, the letter to the senator about 939 and requesting that,
Right.
it be tempered and or withdrawn completely. So people are on top of that for sure. Well, we've had a lot of fairly dire debate today. Can we end on some high notes with any sort of silver linings and observations that you've seen? I know, for one, I'll just throw out that this whole Zoom communication has been a mixed blessing, but it's definitely brought some people in my world together in terms of whether it's family members or partners in other offices in San Francisco or Century City. And once it's forced some of us older folks to figure out some technology. And so I throw that out as the opening one, that even with its flaws, it's great to see all four of you, or three of you and me, online here without having to be together in a room. So that's a positive result. But what about on your ends of the business? What do you see as some opportunities, silver linings from this? Mike?
Yeah, I'll just throw a couple quick ones that come to mind. One of the first is I just have to send out a thank you to peers in our industry. I can tell you that Steve Court, River Rock, and Melanie Colbert, my peers, we've had a weekly call now for a couple of months, and it's been even added Brookfield from LA, Robert Cushman, and we've gotten together and we've shared what we're doing, what we're trying, best practices, and it's been really, really helpful. And at times it's been really good therapy just to commiserate about the challenges we face. So I think it's brought us together from that standpoint. Clearly, we've had to communicate better. I know as a company, we've communicated, more proactively than ever before, and I think there's elements of that we're going to continue on, even in non-crisis times. And I think the communication with customers, sometimes they're hard conversations, but we've gotten to know their businesses, their business model, their customer, their strategy better than ever before, and through a lot of these conversations. And I think that's going to serve us well in the long term. And I think the last thing I'd just say is the work from home thing, even though it's a risk to the office, office demand long term, the truth is I think it's worked pretty well, and especially for a company like ours, it's pretty conservative, and we say customer facing. It's I think informed us a little bit better that we can use it to probably a higher degree than we have in the past. So those would be three things that are pluses.
Dave, I'd say in finishing up, I think the one thing that all landlords, big or small, should realize, that this is such a critical time for these retailers, that there is a decisiveness that is going on. You can get to the right people and they can make decisions on things that have been floating around for years, and you couldn't get anybody to address it. And I think that's the one thing. If you're willing to go and work with them, get your list together and you'll get an answer. And I think that's a very positive thing. I think the other thing on ending this, this is wearing everybody out. And now you got social unrest, and this is very unsettling. This is very unsettling. But I will tell you, there are two things at play here when we come out of this. I really believe that we will come out of this very strong once we come out of it. I'm not Pollyanna, but if you visualize a vaccine or some sort of a treatment that takes down the mortality rate of this thing, pent-up demand is a very powerful economic engine, and we've never had pent-up demand like this in 100 and something years. And anecdotally, the guys that have opened, the Rosses, the TJXs, they're doing a lot of business. They're doing more business than they did last year at this time. So that's the definition of pent-up demand. Now, they're not making as much money because of inventory. It's old. And so still, there's a lot of business going on. That, coupled with the amount of government money going into the system, I believe will lead us out into a very, very profitable time. It's just going to take some time. I study Katrina and what happened in the South after Katrina. If you want to look at what government monies do to an economy, the area boomed. The area boomed. It took time, but it just absolutely, the Southeast just boomed. And I really believe we're going to have very good days ahead. This is going to end, guys. It's going to end. Not soon enough, but it's going to end.
Rick, any parting thoughts?
No, I just, Pat just made me feel a lot better on a gloomy day. So, no, for me personally, just slowing down a little bit. I had a horrendous commute for years and I haven't had that commute. So allowed me more time to think a little bit more deeply about the stuff that I'm doing and to have some pretty constructive dialogues with clients. So that's all positive for me.
Yeah, I think I'd like to think that people in general, but for this past week's tragedies and a whole nother arena we really can't even talk about, that's really unfortunate that there are that many people that are upset out there in the world and taking it out, and the people that are taking advantage of the legitimate protesters and further dragging down our economy and our government and our relations with each other. I was going to say before that all happened, it did feel like people were being a little nicer to one another because we're all in this boat together.
I agree.
It's a shame that the events of the last 10 days or so have sort of torn at that, because I was feeling a lot better about people's compassion and teamwork and support of each other through this pandemic. And hopefully we can get back to that. We got a lot of work to do. So thank you guys all. Really appreciate it.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Jane, Kristen, any final parting thoughts for our listeners before we tune out?
Hi, Dave. Yeah, I just have a couple things.
Okay.
Thank you so much for working on this panel, moderating, keeping the conversation going, and just thank you to all of our speakers, Pat and Mike and Rick, for sharing your time and your valuable expertise. We're certain that a lot of attendees on this call have taken notes and have some great strategies to really think about here.
Answers.
Thank you all so much.
Thank you for having us.
All righty.
Thank you.
For all of our attendees, we hope you guys found the town hall helpful and educational. On the screen is a link to BOMA International's coronavirus resource website and BOMA OC's resource page and contact information. Should you have any questions about today's discussion, or if you want more information about BOMA Orange County, how to get involved. I know Dave referenced the Government Affairs Committee about SB 939, the letter format, and there's just great resources there. So please check all that out. Again, thanks to everybody. Thank you to our speakers and our sponsors, and thank you for joining.
Have a great day.
Great being together.
Everybody, take care.
Be safe out there, everybody.
Yeah. Take care.